Crown Prince in exile, Reza Pahlavi, who said no real change can happen in Iran until there's an end to theocratic dictatorship and a move to democracy. Here's more from him on that. In the past, one of the ways you have said that should be done is through Western backing. I'm curious now that we are nearly a year into the Trump administration, and we've seen just over the course of the last week and a half or so how President Trump has reacted, namely via Twitter with scathing attacks on the regime. What do you think of how he has dealt with this round of protests?
I think that the general support so far demonstrated by the Trump administration has been received positively by my compatriots. However, I think that as we look at the practical steps to be taken to actually be of help to a nation, there are more steps that can be taken. As you know, communication is vital for people to be able to organize themselves. As you know, the regime has tried, as always, to try to repress information, to censor communication, to slow down the internet, to create all sorts of filters so people cannot connect to platforms such as Instagram or Telegram and what have you. There's a lot of technological assistance that can be done. Some of them are barred as a reason of the policy of sanctions that makes some companies, for example Google, that can provide the kind of access to be clarified as to whether or not they're violating sanctions by doing something in that direction or not. There are some specific steps that this administration can take. But beyond that, and in general sense, I think leaders of democratic countries have to understand that dialogue has to be established at some point with representative of the people who demand democratic change. You're not going to be able to find all the answers by limiting your access only to the regime and its representatives. That's a very critical issue at this stage.
So I want to take that a step further. Back in May, when you and I spoke, you mentioned that you would like the United States to play an active role in regime change. Do you still stand by that? And if so, what would you like to see happen?
I don't think any foreign government should advocate a policy of regime change. But if they take the position that we support the Iranian people in their desire for freedom to be at their hand determining the future that they deserve, it's basically supporting a democratic call of another nation as democracies. And therefore, the process itself will lead to a change of regime. But that's the decision that the Iranian people want to make and are making. But they want the world to take a position. Are you going to be with us this time? Are you going to still throw us under the bus and continue maintaining the status quo by talking only to this regime? If this process changes, the paradigm will change, and it will lead to regime change, not as a result of the foreign policy of a foreign government, but as a result of the people on the streets ultimately reaching what they are demanding with the support and backing of the international community, particularly democracies.
Mr. Pahlavi, I don't know if you've seen it, but there was a harsh personal attack against you put on social media, I believe by the Iranian ambassador to the UK. Do you think the regime in Tehran perhaps is starting to see you as something of a threat, and are you concerned about that?
Well, of course, you know, it's not the first time the regime will react to anyone they consider as a threat. And of course, I think that by virtue of the fact that in the last few days the specific focus has been on me, certainly the threat level is elevated. But that's part of in the nature of what we are doing. You know, it's a struggle that involves taking all the risks necessary to be able to be of help. And I've always, the story of my life has been to be a very visible target for the regime, and you know that's part of what we need to do to save our country. I'm prepared to sacrifice my life if necessary, but at the same time I'm prudent, at the same time I'm smart about this, and I think a lot of Iranians are also smart about that, and we are not going to be impeded or in any form or shape intimidated by the regime's attacks or threats. And in fact, the more they do that, the more it invigorates us to stand up and fight until we finally succeed and claim our country back.
Before we let you go, I want to broaden the picture for a minute, because besides Iran trying to suppress those protests over the last week and a half, there is, of course, the nuclear deal. Iran just today warning the international community that President Trump could back out from the nuclear deal altogether. The next deadline is this week on January 11th. Do you think that the Trump's administration's approach so far, a hard line against Iran, decertifying the deal, has emboldened hardliners in Iran or done the opposite?
Look, I think everybody has to understand that the nuclear issue is just one aspect of the overall picture as it relates to the Iranian regime. I believe that today, if you're talking about whether or not this would lead to further sanctions, it should not revolve around simply the nuclear deal. It has to revolve also for the violation of human rights. It has to also involve the fact that this regime has systematically wanted to interfere in affairs of other countries, from Syria to Yemen, etc. It is not just the nuclear issue that should be subject to any consideration of further sanctions or what. It's the overall behavior and attitude that this regime has on that scale as well. And therefore, I think that this should not be only limited to the subject.
Very briefly, should he withdraw altogether from the nuclear deal?
My position was, at the time the deal was proposed, that it's better to have a deal than no deal whatsoever, not to escalate this thing to a military confrontation, which to me has always been a lose-lose proposition. On the other hand, the criticism we had about that deal was because there was no guarantee that if any funds are released, first of all, what is going to end up serving. And as we always imagine to be the case, the regime is not going to spend it on the betterment of lives of the Iranian people. It's going to spend it and continue its proxy wars, whether it's in Syria or backing Hezbollah or everything else that it's traditionally been doing. And the net result is that the regime has had some respite, given the harsh economic situation that Iran is facing, by having access to more money that they obtained over the last few months, that have utilized towards their own sustenance, as opposed to affecting betterment of the situation for the Iranian people. So net-net, I don't know what is the final benefit that this deal is going to provide in terms of it being in the interest of the people of Iran, or for that matter, the rest of the world. At some point, we need to figure that as long as this regime is in Iran, none of the problems we are facing are going to disappear. And once this regime is gone, all of these major problems will disappear overnight, whether it's terrorism, whether it's radicalism, whether it's the nuclear threat. All of these will disappear once this regime is gone.